Hi everyone, and welcome to the QDU Academy session for Year 10, Round 3. This session will be addressing the long prep topic that we regret true crime media. A brief overview on what we'll be taking a look at. First off, we'll take a look at a couple of points of context surrounding this debate, then a little bit on setup, then a couple of the themes that you might want to brainstorm points around, and finally some general tips. This week we'll be taking a look at trade-offs, which will be especially important for this topic. So first off, some context. I think true crime media has risen in prominence over the past couple of years, and especially over the past couple of months, it has become particularly topical, especially with Netflix's series on Jeffrey Dahmer becoming very prominent and very popular, for better or for worse. One thing to note about this topic, I think especially, is that it is especially controversial, and there are a wide variety of perspectives that emerge when you start doing research on this topic. Um, Obviously, perspectives from different people are likely to be very divided, but particularly so for this topic because they are talking about very different things that concern different people. This means that topics are especially divided. I think some of this division is reflected in the fact that we have very different types of true crime media all along the spectrum. This looks like all the way from indie podcasts, where a couple of people are going out and investigating cold cases, all the way to giant blockbusters produced by Netflix that are funded with millions of dollars and that reach millions of audience members. So have a think about the different sorts of true crime media that we have and how that might result in different sorts of outcomes. You might want to acknowledge that there is a wide range of true crime media, but you could definitely identify some key characteristics that are true across all or the majority of them that will better enable you to make arguments. I think for this topic especially, do not feel obligated to suddenly jump into true crime media, but I think it could be good, especially if you are a little bit unaware of this topic, to do a little scroll through some news headlines, take a look at what people are contributing to this conversation, or otherwise do lots of brainstorming on the different sorts of incentives people have within this field and how people are likely to interact with true crime media or otherwise likely to produce true crime media. Then, so in context, a couple of questions to consider. First off, why was this set as a topic? Obviously, this is addressing a really relevant societal issue, so have a think about this. Then, what is the main problem that this topic is identifying? What is the cause of the problem? What are the effects of the problem? Are all of these effects equally important, or are some effects perhaps more important than others? Then, what is the scale of the problem? And also have a think about since when has it become prominent. This last question is particularly important for considering in terms of setup. So in terms of setup then, the first question to answer when approaching setup is thinking about what type of debate this is. So this is actually a regret topic, and this means that we require different setup from a policy debate or an empirical topic. Most importantly, this requires a counterfactual to be set up from both teams. Apart from that, however, we still need the same definition. You might want to take a look at what the keywords within this topic are. You might identify this a little bit differently from what is up on the screen presently, but I think the main thing really is just making sure you address true crime media. Have a think about what this looks like. You can describe some sort of range here, but it's always good if you're able to make some general statements about what it typically looks like in the majority of situations, so it's a lot easier to make arguments. So let's take a look at the status quo and counterfactuals. So in a regret debate, both teams will need to set up a counterfactual. For anyone that doesn't know right now, a counterfactual is a world in which the regretted event did not happen. So we might need to go a couple of years back and think, oh, if we didn't go down this particular pathway at that point, what would our world look like and what would have happened instead? The affirmative and negative teams' counterfactuals are likely going to be quite different. This is because the affirmative team has the incentive to say the counterfactual is good, because obviously an event is regrettable if something better would have happened instead. On the other hand, the negative team has the incentive to say that the counterfactual is bad, worse than the status quo. In setting up the counterfactual, we want a couple points of description. Importantly, we also want reasons why your counterfactual is likely to have happened, why events would have transpired in this way. Make sure to keep your counterfactual brief. Don't spend too much time on it because obviously the more important part is going to be your arguments. So, what is the actual purpose of counterfactual? The purpose of a counterfactual is to give some sort of basis for you to compare the status quo with, because both teams are going to win by either proving that the counterfactual is better or worse than the status quo. These are the win pathways for affirmative and negative. Note, this assumes that you have proven that your counterfactual is a lot more probable and a lot more likely than the opposition's. You should try and engage with the opposition's counterfactual throughout the debate, try and be charitable, and try and prove that you win on not only your counterfactual, but the opposition's counterfactual as well. The other important thing to note is make sure that you, obviously this is kind of been implied, but make sure your counterfactual is probable and likely. If it is too ridiculous, then it is unlikely that you'll be able to prove that it is true, at which point a lot of your arguments are likely going to fall down. So in setting up a counterfactual, this is the main question that we really want to answer. What would a world without true crime media look like? So have a think about why people consume true crime media. You can definitely identify different incentives apart from what is listed on the screen here, but I think these are a couple of the main ones. So this is things like entertainment, things like gore and horror. People have an innate desire for things that are gory and things that are a little bit horrific and give them some sort of shock factor. And that is something that they are still likely to have and they are still likely to desire, regardless of whether this is fulfilled by true crime media or some other thing. Apart from that, perhaps things like education might also be important. So then have a think about what sort of media would fill this gap instead. Would this look like newspaper articles? Would this look like violent video games or violent horror films? Would this look like cold case reports that have been written up in a very indifferent language from what would be used in true crime media? Have a think about these sorts of things. Finally, another question you may want to consider optionally is, would there still be incentives for people to investigate cold cases, or would this not exist entirely at all? Does this mean that cold cases would remain cold cases forever? Then, in terms of brainstorming points. So, first thing in terms of brainstorming points that is really important to consider is characterization. So, obviously, this topic is focused on true crime media, so it is very important that you give a very thorough characterization of true crime media. So, what does true crime media actually look like? These are a couple of the questions that you might want to consider when you're trying to build your characterization. So, what is the focus of true crime media? What types of true crime does it usually cover? Does it cover things like fraud and burglary and petty theft, or is it typically focused on mythical serial killers, so on and so forth? Then have a think about how does it typically depict victims and criminals? What sorts of characteristics does it typically attribute to them? What sorts of questions does it leave for the audience to consider? So on and so forth. In considering this, one question you may want to answer is have a think about what sorts of incentives the producers of true crime media have. For example, if you identify a profit motive, what does this mean in terms of how they are likely to depict certain things? What does this mean in terms of the focus of true crime media? Is it likely to be on the nitty-gritty details, or is it likely to be focused on horror and gore? Apart from that, other incentives might be things like artistry or a dedication to true crime, or so on and so forth. If we think about all of these different incentives, what might be the strongest or most common incentive? Then, in terms of characterization, we probably also want to take a look at the audience. So, have a think about who consumes true crime media. What age is this audience typically at? What gender is this typically at? What gender is the audience predominantly? How are their views likely to be shaped by true crime media? And is this going to be a positive or negative influence? You do not have to make conclusive or narrow statements on any of these questions, but I think it is still very useful to have ideas of how it happens the majority of the time. This is obviously very useful for your arguments. A couple of the clashes to think around for your points. Firstly, cold cases. Do a lot of cold cases get solved? Is this worth any other trade-off? Secondly, education. Does true crime induce paranoia in its audiences, or are there useful safety lessons which can be learned from true crime? Has true crime been recorded to prevent crime ever, or is this a really small benefit that only affects a small minority of people? Societal views. Are criminals typically depicted favorably or unfavorably in true crime media based off of the incentives of these producers? What is typically depicted as their reason for committing a particular crime? Are victims, on the other hand, depicted as powerful heroes or otherwise? How does this affect the different demographics that may exist within the audience? Finally, then, stakeholders. Thinking of stakeholders is a really excellent way to brainstorm a greater variety of points and also impact effectively. Have a think about who is affected by this debate. Who do we care the most about? Why? Will this be the same for both the affirmative and negative teams? One very useful thing that you can do is sectioning off any large stakeholders. Sectioning off large stakeholders is useful for a variety of reasons. First off, it is a lot more strategic and it allows you to more reliably claim a greater bunch of these stakeholders. It also makes arguing and also rebutting a lot easier. If you're able to identify that, for example, within the audience, there are lots of different people, but maybe one really key audience that comprises the majority of the audience stakeholder is perhaps teenage girls that really like true crime and use this as an outlet for wanting to consume sort of those horror and gore genres. How might they specifically be influenced by true crime media? Are they likely to take good things or bad things from this, specifically due to things like their age? Perhaps they are not mature enough to consume this, or perhaps their gender means that they feel particularly enfranchised by this form of media. Finally, an important warning for in terms of stakeholders. Remember to treat this topic and stakeholders with lots of sensitivity. So obviously, we are talking about people whose lives have been dramatically affected by true crime specifically, and also true crime media. This looks like victims and particularly their families as well. So make sure that you treat different whenever you're talking about stakeholders. You do not make any harmful generalizations and you treat them with sensitivity and make sure you use sensitive language. Other sorts of stakeholders you may want to consider are producers of true crime media, and also specifically in terms of the people involved in cold cases, people like victims, victims' families, the criminals themselves, and also the original investigators. So, are these people likely to have been very successful within this cold case? I think cold case kind of implies that they were not very successful, but what sorts of incentives do they have in this area? Are they likely to ever be held accountable unless it is by a true crime? Finally, some general tips. So, the main thing we'll take a look at is trade offs. So, a trade off is when you argue at the end of a point or an issue that your impact is ultimately more important than a different impact which is achieved by the opposition. For example, you might make a trade off between saving 10 children versus saving 10 puppies. You might say, we care about human children more. Even if this is only 10 children, we would save 10 children over 100 puppies. So, trade offs are particularly important in debates where the benefits of each team will likely not overlap, such as this debate. A couple of the metrics by which to prove an impact is more important than another. Firstly, the number of people affected. So, we would likely want to improve the lives of 100 people than one person. Secondly, the severity of the effect. We probably prioritize more severe effects like death and so on and so forth, compared to smaller things like slight inconvenience. Then the vulnerability of the stakeholder. Have a consideration of whether they can protect themselves. Is this particular harm going to plunge them into further disadvantage? We probably care more about weaker people than we do about people that are able to protect themselves or otherwise have received significant advantage from society. Final thing to note when using trade offs, obviously, you should try and win the debate on multiple grounds and on the opposition's material as well. However, trade offs can be particularly useful, especially nearing the ends of debates, if you think the opposition is doing really well on a particular issue. If you are able to say that even if your benefit is small, it is still a lot more important than any benefit that the opposition achieves, this makes it a lot more convincing and you are a lot more likely to win the debate. At the end of this presentation, please note that we have lots of different resources on our QDU YouTube page. Please take a look at the more specific videos that we have on different topics if you are struggling with anything, for example, writing practical points. Thank you very much.